Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 13.4 for PSY 235, Social Psychology. In this section of the chapter, you're learning to identify aspects of our social lives that can actually increase the likelihood or increase the perception of prejudice. We are surrounded, as you already know from what you've studied in this class already, that the pressure to conform to the normative rules in our social groups is very strong. So one of the things that can help us understand why prejudice either is expressed or not expressed is determined by the norms that surround the person. So normative conformity can help us to understand why some people, even if they have deeply prejudicial attitudes, may choose not to act on them. If the environment around them is very normatively opposed to blatant prejudice, to blatant racism or sexism, for example, a person who harbors those beliefs may hide them in public spaces, but then act on them in private. It can also explain why some people who are not prejudiced may actually behave in a discriminatory way if the norms on the ground support it. So, for example, you could have a person who doesn't personally believe the stereotypes or the prejudice that's levied at a particular social group, but the norms that surround them, maybe the norms of their workplace, for example, or the norms in their family, the norms in their community, may pressure them in order to stay a member of the group to behave in a discriminatory way, maybe to say mean things or to follow policies or whatever. Based on the norms on the ground, it can really shape whether or not you express those prejudiced attitudes. There's also research showing that people in societies where there's a lot of stereotypical information available and where discrimination is the norm will actually conform to such an extent that they build prejudiced attitudes and then will behave in ways that are consistent with them when the situation allows it to occur. So, for example, if you have a social situation, a social setting, it could be a town or a community or a school or even a whole country, where you have a high density of stereotyped information coming from the media, from social media, from all kinds of sources, and the behavioral norms on the ground are that discrimination is tolerated, then you're likely to see higher levels of endorsement of prejudiced attitudes and higher levels of frequency of discrimination in terms of people's actual behaviors. When the norms change, maybe laws are changed, customs are changed, prejudice also is impacted. So, for example, when we started to see a dramatic shift in the 1990s in attitudes towards gay marriage, prior to the 1990s, we had the majority of the country, when surveys were done, the majority of Americans were opposed in a blanket way to gay marriage. Over the course of the 1990s, though, we saw a dramatic flip-flop. Part of this could be due to the fact that we had many, many more celebrities who were LGBT, and they were out and they were public and they were beloved, meaning that they had a high degree of popularity and people respected them. When that started to happen, and we started to see some changes in laws in many states, and then eventually we had in the 2000s the passage through the Supreme Court ruling that dictated that gay marriage was legal. You saw a dramatic shift in social norms. Now, fast forward to today, I'm sitting here in 2025, we're seeing a lot of pushback. So at a cultural level, you see that when the norms change, so does the willingness to express and then act on prejudice. So right now we see a lot of really a big cultural divide on issues like attitudes towards LGBT people, and legislation is being passed. For many people, the norms are shifting on the ground about what they can say, what they can believe, and what they can do. So we're seeing increases right now in expressions of prejudice toward LGBT people, particularly trans people, and extreme pressure to pass legislation to control those individuals, including an attempt, which to date failed, to get the Supreme Court to reconsider its decision on gay marriage. Another line of research that helps us to understand on the ground how prejudice and discrimination play themselves out is the idea that, and these are theories that are most at home in sociology, but really are useful here as well. The idea that we tend to see our world in a fairly dichotomous way. Social identity theory really posits this idea that we tend to sort our world into us and them. And we tend to feel emotions that are connected to that distinction. And then we tend to fashion beliefs that support those emotions as well. Your authors talk about the concept of ethnocentrism, which is the idea that your own culture, your own nation, even your own favorite team, your religion is superior to all others, and superior in significant ways, like the dogma is correct, the value system is correct, and it is superior to all others. This feeds into and is connected to social identity, which, if you recall, all the way back to the chapter on the self, social identity refers to that part of your self-concept that's based in your identification with big level groups, like your religious orientation, your political affiliation, your occupational group, your regional identification, and so on. And ethnocentrism can become an expression of that social identity kind of orientation. Ethnocentrism and the tendency to use social identity as a justification for it is unfortunately a universal phenomenon. Every culture has a tendency to value its own way of doing things, its own belief system, its own value system, over other systems, other ways of seeing the world. And it's very easy to fall into that trap. Even within our culture at the present time, we have a very deeply divided electorate, where you have about half the country leaning to the left and about half the country leaning to the right, with a significant chunk of people lurking around in the middle. And it's very, very easy for people to drift in the direction of taking an ethnocentric approach to seeing the other side as, in fact, a different culture. So there are a lot of political scientists who have been talking recently about this idea that people are perceiving the United States at the moment as two countries, one that leans left and one that leans right. And that's very problematic because it tends to activate that sense of intense social identity and the tendency to see the us versus the them. And the them represents a threat to resources, threat to liberty, threat to all kinds of freedoms, and so on. So the impulse that is behind the ethnocentric tendency and the tendency to see our world in this dichotomous us versus them way, it boils down to suspicion and fear. Originally in our evolutionary history, the evolutionary biologists would argue that part of this is evolutionary. The idea is that earlier in our history, if people you didn't know were coming near you, they didn't belong where you were, they were probably not coming with good intentions in mind. So we apparently, as a species, evolved to have a deep level of suspicion and fear of quote-unquote outsiders. Now, as we have evolved, we certainly have the capacity to use more critical thinking about that and do some evaluation, but our tendency is still very, very strongly in the direction of saying, you are dangerous until you prove otherwise. Some researchers also have argued, and this comes more from the neuroscience side of things, that there may be, in fact, a neurological basis for fearing our outgroups. In other words, we tend to be wired to perceive difference. And when we perceive difference, we appear to fairly automatically respond with fear and suspicion. So some researchers are arguing that our brains have evolved in this way and they continue to function in that way. There's also some emerging evidence. And when I use the phrase emerging evidence, it means that there's some evidence, but we need to do replications and see more research. But there's some emerging evidence that people who score super high on ethnocentrism and also tend to lean in the direction of strong prejudiced attitudes and willingness to be discriminatory against outgroups tend to show different patterns of neural activity in the brain in comparison to people who are less vulnerable to those expressions. So it will be interesting to me to see how that research evolves. From a social psychology perspective, what we have typically done research on is the way in which this division into in-groups and out-groups, us versus them, is reflected in our social behavior. And one way that that's the case is something called in-group bias. In-group bias is simply having good emotional reactions, positive emotional reactions, and giving special treatment to people we see as being part of our own group. And sometimes we give this preferential set of emotions and preferential treatment without being aware that that's what we're doing. Now, sometimes your in-group bias is obvious and you know it, everyone knows it, and it's part of the game. But in some situations, behaving in this in-group biased way is unconscious. So we need to pay attention to both of those. We also have a tendency, when we've identified clearly an in-group versus an out-group, we tend to express negative feelings and engage in discriminatory behavior against those people in the out-group just because they're in the out-group. You know, not the best example, but, growing up, we had a rival high school, and our tendency was, as, athletes, or when we were, in the football season, whatever it was, they were our out group. We hated them. We called them names. It didn't matter who they were. We didn't like them. And our in group, we tend to give the benefit of the doubt. No questions asked. So that tends to be the way it rolls out. Now, what can pierce that bubble is when you have other kinds of interactions that can break it down. Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of those opportunities. One of the reasons why the in-group bias is so strong is because it feels so validating. It feels great to be sitting with your friends, to be sitting in your in-group and making fun of people who are in an out-group. It's probably one of the reasons why we have so much social media right now showing, or, social media from the beginning of social media, showing people making fun of other people who they identify as the out-group. There are multiple genres on TikTok, for example, where that seems to be the only point, is to pick out an example of a person who's a member of your out-group and then just shred them online. Now, the reason why we do this, according to social psychologists, is because it boosts your self-esteem to do it. And it boosts your self-esteem in two ways. It bolsters your sense of identity with your own social group, and it does, and that is amplified by the fact that you're creating this opposite, the outgroup. And by labeling them as everything you are not, it makes you feel better about yourself. So there's a self-esteem motive here. Self-esteem is going to be enhanced when you see your group as superior to other groups. And it can be kind of addictive to feel that way, to feel so superior. I know a lot of people, on my social media contacts, there are some people who they seem to relish in every post that they make, making fun of the people whose politics they disagree with. And it has this really toxic effect. It makes them feel better and it makes them feel superior to the outgroup, but it does nothing to solve social problems. In fact, it can enhance prejudice, enhance discrimination, enhance conflict as well. So in-group bias, it may feel great in the moment, but it really causes a lot of problems. One of the techniques that has been used, and this is quite an old technique, for studying in-group bias is referred to as minimal groups designs or minimal groups experiments. In these studies, you take complete strangers and using a random system, you assign them to groups. Maybe it's because of their eye color or based on their birth date, whatever. You assign them randomly to groups. Like one time I was in an event where we were randomly assigned to groups based on whether our birth month was odd or even. So trivial criteria put you in groups. Then what you do is you do some assessment. You find out how much do you like the people in your group, how much do you dislike the people in the other group, and so on. What we found, what researchers find, even when you randomly assign people to groups, they had no choice about where they landed. They just landed in their group. They tended to like the members of their own group better, and they tended to rate the members of their own group as having better personalities, as being more able to get work done, and they started to cut down the outgroup member to say that they're less pleasant and less capable and less competent. Participants also show favoritism in terms of allocations of things like rewards. So even when people are randomly assigned to a group, they have nothing in common other than they've been assigned to the group, especially when they're put into competition with another group, with an outgroup. They are likely to show strong effects of in-group bias, both in terms of how they perceive their in-group members and how they perceive the outgroup. They will also have a tendency to discriminate. So they'll give benefits to their own group and deny benefits, or in fact incur punishments on the outgroup. One outgrowth of this is something called outgroup homogeneity. And what this is a tendency to be perceiving your own group as consisting of lots of nuanced people with lots of diversity. So inside your in-group, you know these people a little bit more, even when you're randomly assigned to the group, just because you're standing with them, sitting with them, talking with them, you feel like you have more knowledge of who they are. And your perception is going to be that they're each unique individuals who have one thing in common, and that is in-group membership. The outgroup, however, tends to be seen in a way that reflects they are all alike. So you're not in part of their group. They are one thing, and you identify them in stereotypical terms that often are derogatory and oversimplified. So what you're missing is the perception of the diversity of that outgroup, and that interferes with your ability to see them as individuals. So in-group members tend to perceive outgroup members as much more similar to each other, and they will tend to then put traits onto those individuals that are typically more negative, more critical to those outgroup members than you would apply to your own in-group, Even if you apply some of those negative to certain members of the in-group, you will declare those exceptions to the usual behavior. Like maybe you have an example of someone in your in-group who broke a law one time. What you will do, because they are in your in-group, is you will believe excuses for that person's behavior, and you will make an argument that their character is still solid. If, however, an out-group member breaks the same law, the assumption will be, see, out-group people, in whatever group it is, are lawbreakers, right? So that same behavior will be interpreted completely different based on whether the person is in your in-group versus your out-group. You can kind of see the obvious outcomes here. Whenever you have people who have decision-making capacity, if they have a strong sense of in-group bias and a perception of out-group homogeneity, it sets them up to behave discriminatorily and feel 100% justified in doing so. Another way that this plays itself out is the very disturbing thing called blaming the victim. Basically, when you hold prejudiced attitudes and then believe stereotypes associated with those attitudes, it impacts dramatically the degree to which you are willing to feel empathy for outgroup members. Empathy can be really hard for people to feel when, if you're being judgmental. So as your authors put it, empathy is difficult for those who have routinely been judged on the basis of their own merit, and not on their racial, ethnic, or religious or other group membership. So if you have a person, basically what your authors are saying here is, if you have a person who's never been judged based on their outgroup status, they may have a hard time understanding what it's like to be judged in that way. So if you're a person from a majority group who has had a lot of privilege and access, you may find it extremely difficult to see from the point of view of someone who has not had those kinds of privileges and who has been subject to a great deal of prejudice and discrimination. Part of what is happening when we are engaging in the blaming the victim phenomenon is that we want to see the world as basically fair and just. It's really hard to live in a world that feels chaotic, that feels like there's no fairness, that there's no justice. And that is argued by the theorists who proposed the blaming the victim theory. It's argued to terrify us, and we need to restore the sense of our world as fair and just. If we are witness to someone who experiences a very bad outcome, maybe someone is a victim of sexual assault, or they've been robbed, or they have been in a bad car accident, or even if they contract a form of cancer, the question will arise because let's say that whoever has these bad outcomes, they're part of your social atmosphere, and you look at them and you go, that's a really bad outcome. I'm really scared of that bad outcome. How can I feel like that bad outcome is something that will not happen to me? What you can do by engaging in blaming the victim thinking is to say to yourself, well, they did something to make it more likely for that to happen. So this is what happens when people who are sexually assaulted, when they are questioned, when they are asked, why were you in that place by yourself? Why were you walking where you were walking? Why were you wearing what you were wearing? Why were you leading that person on? And so on. What's the goal here is to restore your sense as the perceiver that you're a good person and good outcomes should come to you. Therefore, random acts of violence, or even violence that's committed on people who don't deserve it, you need to restore some balance there. So the victim needs to have done something to make it more likely that they would become a victim. That restores your sense that good people will have good outcomes and bad people, or at least not so smart people, will have bad outcomes. So basically, most people, when they're confronted with the fact that there's an unfair outcome that's hard to explain for them, they'll find a way to blame the victim. When something bad happens to another person, we might feel sorry for them, but at the same time, we're glad it isn't us that it's happened to. And in order to keep that kind of balance, because feeling sorry for someone who didn't deserve it is pretty painful, and it reminds us we are equally at risk rather, of the same fate. This was really, really common in the past. So during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and early 90s, it was very, very common for people to say, you are an AIDS, you're an AIDS patient in a hospital, for example, even children who contracted AIDS. If people could come up with a justification that said, well, if you hadn't been having sex with the wrong kind of people, if you hadn't been doing IV drugs on the street, you wouldn't be sick. Now, would you? So you were a bad person, and that's why you're sick now. Even with children in the 80s, there were whole hospital wards in some major cities during that time period that were just for children who had been born with HIV infections and then later developed AIDS. And people in the public were vicious to these children, not necessarily in person, but definitely in public. And they would say things like, well, if your parents hadn't been irresponsible, immoral, if your mothers in particular hadn't been drug addicts, then you, child, wouldn't be sick. So it's a way of blaming the victim in a really, really hostile fashion that hurts people. This reasoning in the research on blaming the victim effects, it leads to, making demands that the outgroup conform to higher standards of behavior. So, for example, it's well understood that in our culture, we tend to hold females to a very high standard of behavior. Like, it's expected that when they are out in public, getting drunk is not okay. And if you were to be sexually assaulted and you happen to be intoxicated at the time, you're going to be blamed for that sexual assault. In contrast, if a man is drunk and engages in sexually assaultive behavior, his behavior is often excused because he was drinking. So it's a very different dynamic, and it's really kind of couched in that, in the fact that we have stereotypes and prejudice attitudes against females in our culture. Justifying feelings of entitlement is another variable that has been studied in relatively recent research in prejudice and discrimination. We've seen a lot of research coming out of both political science and social psychology looking at this sense of entitlement, of what you believe you deserve from your world. And there's a connection, there's a correlational relationship between feeling entitled and feeling like you're better than other people. And those variables, entitlement and superiority, are also correlated with prejudiced attitudes toward outgroups. So prejudice tends to support your in-group's assessment of itself as the best. And that tends to lead to or be associated with your sense that you deserve good things to happen to you. So whenever you have a majority group that engages in systematic discrimination against a minority group, and, part of the reason they're doing that is in order to secure their power, to make sure that they remain in control. The claim will be that they have to do this because the minority is not competent, that they're inferior to others. So there's been a lot of rhetoric out in the news media, but also in the social media atmosphere about the SNAP benefits. So during the government shutdown in 2025, the shutdown went on so long that supplemental nutrition benefits, SNAP benefits, formerly referred to as food stamps, weren't able to be delivered. There was a lot of rhetoric coming out of the majority where they were arguing that these are people who are lazy. These are people who are inferior. They just need to go get jobs. Or if they don't have enough money based on the job they have, they need to get another job. So they're using their argument that these are people who don't deserve benefits, don't need benefits, and they're justifying it with statements that these are people who are lazy and incompetent, and they don't deserve taxpayer money as a result. Now, what's been found is that people who need SNAP benefits are usually in social groups that have endured systemic institutional discrimination for long periods of time. Basically, the poor tend to receive a great deal of discrimination against them, and it serves to keep them basically poor. And then the justifications that are given by the majority, people who have more money than them, is that, you're in the position you're in due to your own actions, to your own inability to control yourself, your bad choices, and so on. So people who are in dominant positions do tend to see themselves as being completely justified in their feelings. They don't see themselves as prejudiced. They don't see themselves as engaging in discrimination. They see their beliefs about the outgroup as being absolutely reasonable. There was a big blow up on social media during the government shutdown where one woman went onto TikTok and she's snacking. She's eating food and simultaneously saying really, really abhorrent things about people on SNAP benefits, that they need to make better choices about their food and so on, and basically implying that these people are stupid, that they're incompetent, that they're lazy, and they don't deserve taxpayer help. Well, she got a lot of blowback and she got in a lot of trouble. But at the same time, she got a lot of support from people who were in her in-group. Realistic conflict theory is a theory that derives from several different traditions. I mean, it comes out of sociology. There are also realistic conflict theorists who come out of economics, behavioral economics, as well as social psychology. The idea behind realistic conflict theory is that you do have groups who come into conflict with each other. There are disputes about resources like land or water, or money, funding, for example. And when you have limited resources, whatever the resource is, that can lead to intergroup conflict. When that conflict is really intractable, that can lead to the development of really strong prejudice, and it can lead to discriminatory outcomes. And it doesn't take much time for it to occur. We can set people up in the laboratory, assign them at random to groups, and then create a situation of limited resources. And very, very quickly, people will lapse into in-group preference, and they will conflict with their outgroup because of those limited resources. When the resources are unlimited, there's very little reason for conflict, and the groups don't conflict. So one theory is that part of what drives prejudice and discrimination is conflict over scarce resources. This can be in the form also of intergenerational fights. I'm seeing this a lot on my social media feed. where generations are coming at each other. Especially, we're in a kind of a cultural moment where we're under a lot of stress as a culture. It's like every day is a new horrible thing that's happening. So we're under a lot of stress. And when that happens at a cultural level, generations can tend to come after one another, emphasizing that my generation is better than your generation because of X, Y, and Z, and vice versa. So tensions between generations do tend to flare up when we feel like resources are not being fairly allocated. So, for example, I have seen a lot of content out on social media where some younger people are really kind of angry with people who are from the baby boom generation, from the sandwich generation, and from Gen X for squandering their resources and then demanding that they, the young people, take care of them when they're old. And then there's the reverse, where you have older people who are condemning younger people for being selfish and self-centered and refusing to care for older individuals, and so on. So these intergenerational tendencies, or tensions rather, are in some ways explainable through realistic conflict theory. Another finding that's associated with this theory is that when you have a leader who's weakened, so either they're unpopular or they're stalled within their governments, meaning they can't take a lot of effective action, they will often target a minority group and create a scapegoat with them. I think you can see evidence of that currently in the American political landscape, where you have a political party that's having trouble maintaining its numbers, meaning its popularity is on the decline. There's a lot of controversy associated with them. So the leadership will tend to target particular minority groups and go after them, and suggest that these are the people who are the cause of all the problems that are surrounding us. In some ways, it's sort of like a distraction tactic, but it also tends to reinforce the sense inside their in-group that they in fact are right. One example of this is the finding, and this is a long-standing finding, when we have higher unemployment rates, so as unemployment tends to rise, and right now, in November of 2025, hiring is really suppressed. So what happens under those circumstances? There tends to be a high degree of resentment against particular kinds of minorities. In our 2025 reality, the target is people who are immigrants, people who have come to this country from other countries. Regardless of how they got here, why they got here, they become the target when employment is seen as scarce. So right now we're in, a lot of companies are in hiring freezes, or in fact they are cutting jobs. What does that make the in-group feel? They feel threatened, and they're going to pick a target that they feel justified in claiming has been stealing their jobs. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 13.4. In the next video, we'll be looking at the conditions that can be used to reduce prejudice.